Hi, and welcome to this video on World War II. Today we're going to discuss how the U.S. helped European democracies in their struggle against Adolf Hitler. So in this segment, we're going to look at the third-term election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Lend-Lease program, the Atlantic Charter. We're going to take a look at U-boats and submarine warfare, isolationism versus interventionism, and lastly, we'll talk about December 7th, 1941, a day which lived in infamy, or the attack on Pearl Harbor. Okay, so let's begin. So by 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt successfully engages in a third presidential campaign and wins. He is the first and only president in American history to ever win a third term. I should point out that the U.S. Congress in 1951 will pass an amendment, the 22nd Amendment, which will basically prevent that from happening again, limiting the president to 2 terms. However, it should be noted that in 1940, no such amendment was on the books, and the president was free to run for as many times as they would like. So the United States follows a professed path of isolationism in regard to the events that are unfolding in Europe. That is to say that the president, along with many Americans, do not want to get involved in another European conflagration. However, the United States does have a historic ties to our allies, Great Britain. And so what we do is get involved in something called the destroyer deal, and essentially what this does is FDR trades 50 U.S. World War I era destroyers in exchange for British bases in Canada and the Caribbean. We also engage in something called the Lend-Lease Act, and essentially what that did is it allowed the president to sell, lend, or lease war materials to any nation whose defense was vital to U.S. security. In reality, the U.S. gave weapons only to the United Kingdom and essentially abandoned a policy of neutrality. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would argue that Lend-Lease was akin to a neighbor's house catching on fire, that it would be folly to stand there and do nothing while your neighbor's house was on fire because of self-interest. That is to say that the fire could spread and catch your own house on fire. However, FDR's critics pointed out Lend-Lease was a lot like chewing gum. Once you lent it to someone, it was very, very unlikely that you were going to get the gum back. So U.S. industries gear up for war and start producing great quantities of arms and equipment for its allied powers. Now, again, I should stress that the production of these war materials was for European nations who were involved in fighting Hitler and were not for the United States military, as many would abhor at the thought of going to war at this point. However, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt meet and agree on a post-war world, and this is known as the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter has many points, but one of the main points that's spelled out in this charter is the idea of self-determination. That is to say that after World War II, should the Allies be victorious, that the new world would be organized such that countries would have the ability to determine for themselves what types of government they would have. All right, let's talk a little bit about merchant ships and how the merchant ships were targets of German submarines or U-boats. This should sound very familiar to you, as this is one of the issues that came up in our discussion of World War I. And what we see happening here is the blue line indicates ships that were sunk, whereas U-boats were sunk. And as you can see here, leading from 1939 all the way up to 1942, there is a staggering amount of ships that are sunk as a result of German U-boats. However, after that time period, 43, 44, etc., you can see that the number of ships sunk decidedly decreases, where the number of U-boats sunk increases. And the reason why this is because of essentially studying the problem and avoiding of your ships being sunk by German U-boats, and that was achieved in a couple of different ways. One of the main ones was by the use of observation planes, alternating one's course in a zigzag pattern, things of that nature. In 1939, FDR got Congress to allow him to sell arms to belligerents, but they could not be shipped in American ships. This was part of what was known as the Neutrality Act of 1939. The Old Man and the Sea cartoon here shows that the Neutrality Acts are preventing the U.S. from giving aid that will help to fight and win the war. On the other hand, this cartoon here, Adolf and the Wolf, shows the reader as a member of the America First group, which wanted the U.S. to stay out of the war because it was none of our business. So this is a professed path of neutrality. We also see in 1940, a year later, the enactment of the Selective Service Act. And what this does is it sets up the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. We've had drafts before, but only during wartime. This was a precautionary measure, as many Americans now became convinced that it was just a matter of time before America was to enter the war, and many wanted us to be ready. Propaganda came out on both sides, both the anti-war propaganda as well as pro-war propaganda. Okay, let's turn our attention a little bit to Japan chooses a path of war. So as a result of the Japanese incursion into Manchuria in the early 1930s, the United States put an oil embargo on Japan. Since Japan received 80% of its oil from the U.S., the Japanese were forced to modify their consumption. They also understood that an embargo on Japan would mean that if the Japanese were going to halt the United States, they would have to take a bold action, a bold maneuver in which to buy time, and they would have to do this in the Pacific theater of operation. Japan's war minister, Hideki Tojo, thought war between the U.S. and Japan was inevitable, and he wanted Japan to attack first before the U.S. was fully mobilized or prepared for war. And so as a result, the Japanese war leaders plan, implement, and carry out the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941. The Japanese launched a sneak attack on U.S. military facilities in the Hawaiian Islands, as well as the Philippines. And it was after, or I should say in light of this attack, that the President Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivers this speech to Congress.
Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat or hint of war or of armed attack. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace.